Hello, hello, and welcome to episode 25 of Trails in the Pod. I'm Colin. That's Kevin.
Is your midichlorian count too high? Has it been that way for more than 4 hours? You should call a Jedi and get that checked out.
I don't know, man. I kind of like the feeling of having more midichlorians. There's some power in that. And I got some grudges that I have to settle. So I think I'm going to keep it to myself, honestly.
That's really emblematic of the selfish ideology the Jedi Order practices. And that's the subject of today's episode. Because Colin thinks the Jedi are good.
They
I
are.
think they're worse than Hitler, Stalin, and Mao combined. In fact, dear listener, I'm going to go ahead and say this now. Lay it all out on the table, all my cards. The Jedi Order is a quasi fascist, theocratic cult convinced of their own self righteous superiority, whose blindness, whose arrogance, and whose, to be honest, stupidity is directly responsible for the suffering and death of untold trillions, billions, quadrillions.
And my argument, which is the correct one, is that while there are certainly flawed Jedi and the Order is not perfect, it is far more served as a force for good throughout the thousands of years of its existence. And we need some kind of organization to control the force and to use the force for constructive means, which is what they do. You know, we can criticize the Order all they want. You look at the alternative, and it's literally chaos.
Colin, you talk about them a lot just now as an institution, as an organization for good. They promote order and chaos. So let's begin there. All institutions are susceptible to corruption. The Jedi, nonetheless, and in fact, the Jedi are even more susceptible, Colin, because tell me this. Tell me, Colin, what are the checks on their power? Can you vote them out? No, you can't.
Yes,
They
you
are
can.
above any laws.
No, that is not true. Different planets can have different planetary distinctions depending on how close they are to the Republic, and there are some planets in which Jedi are not allowed to operate upon.
The Jedi Order embody white privilege. They are colonists and imperializers.
Please tell me how Yoda and Mace Windu encapsulate white imperialism.
Okay, let me be a bit more serious about this. Jedi come in, they do an investigation according to their own systems of what's right and wrong. How do you find information? What's good and bad? They decide. They are the judge. They establish the parameters of the case. They're the police. They investigate. The jury. They decide who's innocent, who's guilty, and oftentimes a metaphorical and sometimes literal executioner. They decide on punishment. They kill, they maim, they lock someone up. How is that okay?
They kill in self-defense, and the reason why it's okay is because the Jedi act as a police force, which is mandated and allowed by the Republican government. So in places where they have jurisdiction, they are allowed to do these things. Let's not forget the fact that because they have the force, they have much more attuned senses and are therefore better investigators than puny mortals like you or me.
How can you put the Force on a witness stand? How can you tell this Jedi is on the up and up? They're not corrupt. They're not taking bribes. How do you know if you make the police argument, which I think is not a bad one? Look at the police today. How do we know they're good? We rely on checks and balances. We don't have that for the Jedi.
There are checks and balances. They're just more self-contained. So let me explain. The Jedi are a self-policing organization. There are, how do you put this? Because they are able to sense darkness in others as a collective, they police themselves. Let's be frank here. They're the only ones who can. So you might not like that they self-police, but it's the only way to actually do it. And they have a pretty decent record of finding out who the Dark Jedi are and getting rid of them or exiling them. Plus, to return to your stuff about the abuse of power and investigation and stuff like that, they are guided by a sense of do not kill unless harmed. They do arrest people, and I'm fairly certain then submit them to the secular authorities. It's not like they're holding courts of law. They are able to get confessions out of people by using like forced persuasion and stuff like that. But I've not seen that used for deception.
Let's step back a bit and then lay out what our evidence is. It's going to be mostly from the prequel trilogy of movies, some stuff of what we are told the Jedi Order was like from 4, 5, and 6, and various other bits of information we've picked up here and there. We're not going to be doing the sequels, Colin, and I think you agree, because what do we know about the Jedi Order that Luke founded?
The Jedi, okay, the sequel trilogy sucks completely.
Yes.
I mean, I really like, actually, I like number seven, but then it fails. As true fans, we are ignoring the fact that it exists.
Okay, now let me go about the self-policing bits. We know that they're not a perfect one. The things like Dark Jedi, Bad Jedi, the Sith exist. Also, I want to raise the specter of Jedi who follow the light side, and let's talk later about why is there one universal, like literally universal galactic moral, constant moral code. What about the Jedi who follow the light side, but they're just, kind of assholes? They take the worst interpretation while being in line with, quote, what the light side wants. What kind of appeal from their abuse can you have from a Jedi?
I'm going to need some precision. What Jedi do you have in mind that's doing that?
Let's look about it like this. There's 10,000 or so Jedi for the entire galaxy. That's not that many. There's a couple tens of thousands inhabited worlds. So is it fair to say that for most people, they'll go their entire lives without being in the same system as a Jedi?
Probably. How does this answer my
Not,
question?
yeah, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. Not much experience with them. They're spread out. They're concentrated on the capital across the entire galaxy on Coruscant. So what I'm getting at is that a Jedi comes in, that's going to represent the Order for the most part.
Mhm.
And if there's no appeal from their rules, not unless you go maybe take a dangerous space trip to Coruscant, if you can appeal to the High Council, which maybe may not be. So my original point in the rebuttal is modified slightly, but in a sense, it's that there's so few in number, they're so spread out. How can they possibly think I'm getting at know the cultural local nuances to render fair justice?
Okay, so that
And
is
I
not,
understand this morphed quite a bit.
yeah, this is not at all the question that you asked initially. That's fine. I would point out that the Jedi have the best library in the existence of the galaxy, as far as we are aware. That helps. It's not, completely sufficient, but that helps. We also need to remember the fact that we live in a sci-fi society. You and me are talking via Zoom. They talk via hologram from worlds away. So it is not the case that people on far-flung planets are simply unable to communicate with the core just because they live far away. Some of them are certainly, out of communication at times for sure, but it is a far more likely scenario that they are able to communicate if need be.
Colin. They can communicate all they want. I'll give you that. But they don't have enough life experience to
Who's
do the
they?
communicating. The Jedi.
Because
They're
I'm not talking about the Jedi. I'm talking about the people who you claim the Jedi are oppressing.
it's an insidious form of oppression. Jedi come in, lay down their decrees, their laws, and then vanish. They
That's
don't
not
care the
how it
aftermath.
works. That's not how it works. It's not like they walk in and just put down martial law. They're there for a very precise purpose. And let's not forget that almost all of these missions are like asked for by the people who are sending requests.
By the people. They're pretty selective in who they listen to by the people. We see, Colin, in episode one, open slavery in the Outer Rim on Tatooine. And Qui-Gon Jinn is like, yeah, it happens. What are you going to do?
But
He's not surprised.
do you expect Qui-Gon Jinn to walk in and free all the slaves on Tatooine? Because I don't think he can do that.
No, and I think that gets to a very salient point. There's so few in number. They can do individual acts of good, and rescuing Anakin was a good act. They seem entirely uninterested in structural abuses because they are themselves part of the structure of power. They don't seem at all concerned
No, isn't this completely counter to your point that the Jedi just walk in and make decrees and that's how it is? We see in that example right there of Qui Gon
Not at
Jinn
all.
walking in. Yes, it is. We see that right there. Qui Gon Jinn walks in and respects the rules of the society that he is in. He does not go in there and start swinging his dick around. So, I mean, we can criticize the Jedi for not freeing slaves on Tatooine, fine, but we have to acknowledge the fact that it shows the limitations of their power and their restraint from a legal perspective.
Well, I think you misspoke. I think you meant to say his lightsaber.
He did swing that around, just not at slave
Okay.
owners. But he didn't swing his
Okay.
dick around nowhere.
Okay. So we'll talk later about the weirdly puritanical portions about the control of the personal life of the Jedi themselves. One, you made a cultural relativism argument. They can't go in and say, I'm going to say this is wrong and then stop it. But earlier, you said they are guided by the light side of the Force, which is, so it seems, the arbiter of good and light and truth and whatever. To go on the light side is to follow that code, is to follow the code of being a moral, uprighteous person. Would the light side of the Force be okay with the Jedi making a political argument? We don't have the numbers.
I don't think that that's necessarily a political argument, number one. It's a realism argument. And number two, the Jedi Code is pretty vague on stuff. It's pretty short. All of the stuff that we see reflected on in novels and in the comics shows that the Force speaks to each individual Jedi, and it's not like there's a stricture of things that they follow. They are guidelines. And I'm sure that a lot of them are personally against slavery. I'm sure that light sided people are against slavery, but there is a reality argument you have to make. And I want to stress again that that reality argument shows their limitations.
We are not surprised when the Republic takes no action. They're shown to be rather impotent,
Yeah.
bureaucratic delays, captured by special interests, and the audience is primed to go, that's wrong. That's not okay. And so I think when we see the Jedi Order being aware of these systematic injustices, why can't they send a team of Jedi to Tatooine? Because they know the people are suffering or to help the slaves.
All right, so let's look at this real quick. Tatooine is run by
Okay,
the Hutts. The Hutts are a intergalactic crime organization that is reliant upon slavery, among other things. So you send a
yeah.
team of Jedi to Tatooine, however many you need. You might even successfully free all of the slaves on Tatooine, and if you garrison the Jedi there, you can probably keep them free. However, the Hutts are not going to take that laying down. And everybody from the Outer Rim is going to start increasing their piracy and taking concerted action against the Republic, which leads to a lot more death and to a lot more war.
So what you're saying is, to me, the Jedi should be more integrated. Well, my interpretation of a solution is the Jedi should be more integrated into the structures of the Republic so they can have these institutional, larger scale projects be seen to the completion.
I'm not really sure how I follow your argument here because it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that your argument is why don't the Jedi free the slaves? I explained why they don't free the slaves. Okay, so then they should be more integrated into the Republic, which has nothing to do with what I said. And
Yeah.
then you make another argument that I'm not even sure what it is.
Colin, 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 let me enlighten ye with my brilliance.
I'm waiting.
The Jedi, as you said, they don't have the people, the manpower, the resources to go in, say, here's how it's going to be for a planet, for a system, a sector, and have that stick. They don't
Yeah.
have enough, whatever. So why not partner with the groups that do, i.e., the Republic? Flawed as it is, what other institutional power can there be to help the Jedi go in and enforce the Republic's own laws?
I mean, they
It's
do.
illegal.
They do partner with the Republic. I mean, for Christ's sake, they're generals in the Clone Wars, which I know is one of your critiques of them. But let's finish. We need to consider the fact that Tatooine is not very closely tied to the Republic, if it's even part of the Republic at all. And a lot of the Outer Rim countries are like that. So unless you want the Republic itself to invade these planets en masse and go to war with the Hutts, the Jedi cannot do mass manumission. It is physically impossible.
We like to believe that Tatooine and the Outer Rim systems are de jure part of the Republic, even if de facto there's no
I mean, come
centralized.
on. Isn't it true, even in the prequel trilogy in episode one, that the merchants on Tatooine won't take Republican credits?
My impression of that is that there's multiple currency systems, and that because there's no Republican presence in the Outer Rim, in Tatooine specifically, they don't trust the currency.
So they don't take the currency. There is no Republican garrison. They don't follow the Republican laws. I don't know if it technically is de jure, but it's definitely not part of the Republic de facto.
It's not de facto, but I saw it as when everyone is saying slavery is illegal in the Republic under the Republic's laws, and then everyone else saying, yeah, do you see it being enforced? To me, that was they're like legally port.
I don't remember them saying, "Do you see it enforced?" But I haven't watched the movies in years. I think it's very clear that it's legal on Tatooine. I don't even know if they seriously consider the Republican bodies of law something that they should be following, even in an ideal sense. Again, this is under the Hutts. The Hutts are not part of the Republic.
I'm going to get back to one of my contentions. The Jedi are pulled in multiple directions. On the one hand, you have the light side of the Force, provides an objective moral code. You have to follow the light side. On the other hand, they have to war with the political realism. They can't be everywhere and do everything. And the solution, as I see it, is they don't even try. They know there's awful stuff going on in the outer rim. They know the Republic is captured by the mega corporations and they withdraw. They retreat into mysticism, into prophecies. They seclude themselves when they want, and they intervene when they want.
Yeah, I don't see them as being very secluded, to be honest with you. They travel around quite a lot. We see, for instance, Obi-Wan has very good relationships with a lot of people on the street, such as I think his name is Dex, the guy at the
Yeah.
diner. And that's just one example. So I don't really see them being secluded. The only thing that you can claim they're being secluded in is the fact that all the Jedi have rooms in the Jedi Temple, although it's not like they're staying in them all the time because they're also traveling. And they have the chastity requirements. So, like monasticism, they have to keep that kind of purity. And I know that that's a common criticism, but they're not secluded. And I mean, there are internal debates about how mystical you should get. Mace Windu is not a mystic at all.
No.
And there are a lot of Jedi like that. Just because some people believe in mysticism and prophecies doesn't mean that the Jedi are inherently bad.
Do you think the monastic comparison is a fair one to make for the Jedi?
I mean, to some extent, this is an order that, especially when you're at the temple, it does have things that you're supposed to do at specific times. Being raised up as a child into this kind of, you use the word theocratic. I don't like that, but they do offer practices and they do offer pretty strict strictures that get looser as you get older. Um,
Spiritual?
yeah, spiritual. I mean, I think I can certainly agree to that, but also moral. So that's why I think that there is a comparison to be made between monasticism and the Jedi. But I'm also not somebody who thinks that monasticism is bad.
Let's talk about chastity. And it's not, they can have no attachments. My thesis here is them forswearing the ability to have attachments, especially love and its mirror, hate, is a net negative. They can't, if you cannot love, you're not a complete person. And you certainly should not be deciding essentially court cases.
Again, they don't decide court cases. They arrest people and submit them to the local authorities or to the Republican authorities unless there is like imminent danger. But I disagree with you. I mean, I agree with you that it does inhibit their ability to fully live life. I think a really key piece of comparison that we have to make, I think his name is Mundi, the guy from Megiddo.
Yes.
He can have a family. He does have a wife. And the reason why is because that species produces a very limited number of males. And if he was not to make offspring, then that race would die. So the Jedi have made an exception for him. Notably, what we don't let me finish. Notably, what we don't see is any real difference between how Mundi behaves and any other Jedi that good behaves.
Colin. I'm glad you brought up Mundi, who was a Syrian male,
Yeah, sorry, not
not
Megiddo.
Megiddo.
Megiddo
Yeah.
is Megiddo is the planet he invades during the Clone Wars and Battlefront 2.
He has lots of children for exactly the reasons you describe. That planet and his family is destroyed in the Clone Wars. And he talks to Anakin and he's like, yeah, I was kind of bummed. I didn't let myself feel sad. because that would betray the Jedi Code. What the fuck, man?
I mean, I can see it. Like, nobody likes to be sad, and we have to remember the fact that the Jedi have a mission. And letting your, like, you and me, we feel full brunts of emotions. I know I definitely make bad decisions when my pride is wounded or when I feel sad. I don't get angry very often, so difficult for me to do that. Normally, I'm able to stop acting before that happens. But, certainly emotion leads to fallibility. And the Jedi are trying their best to not be fallible. I can certainly see the argument how, in the attempt of avoiding fallibility, they can be blind to it at times. Sure. But Ki-Adi-Mundi is able to control his emotions to the point where he can acknowledge that what had happened to him is sad, but he is still able to move on and do good for his people and do good for the people of the Republic. While I might not be able to identify with it, I can certainly respect it.
But not letting yourself feel these emotions, it's not just internalizing them and then moving on, or not letting it bog down, or just not letting yourself feel these, I don't want to say human, but these natural emotions. It's a weird closing yourself off to the galaxy, to the world.
So, to me, the only good argument to be made that not experiencing the fullness of those emotions is that it might prevent the Jedi from experiencing empathy, which they need to have in order to deal with the populations that do not live under their same structures. However, we see multiple, in fact, the majority of Jedi are able to express and perform empathy. So I don't really see their ability to control their own emotions and maintain a calmness in the face of tragedy to be a negative trait. I see it as something to be admired.
Okay, so he said death is the way of the Force and is not something to be mourned. And I get the concept, Colin. And that's, I think, this is something Jedi feel, preach even. Don't be sad when someone dies. It's the way of the Force, it's natural. And that's one thing to say if it's a 95-year-old person with a long life. Something else to say if, a bunch of kids were slaughtered in a space battle with plasma raining down on the cities.
So let's talk about actions. Let's talk about why it is that emotions like that are important to feel. Outrage or sadness at like a mass school shooting or young kids being taken up in a war, the proper response to that is that the emotions that you feel spur action towards preventing that from happening, right? Whereas if it's a natural
Yeah.
death or a 95-year-old, you can say these comforting things in order to help the community move on because there's no action that needs to be taken. These guys were going to die anyway. What that tells me is that so long as action is taken to prevent more unnecessary deaths, the emotion is not necessary. What is necessary is for the Jedi to act in whatever ways that they can to prevent more of it from happening, which they do, or at least attempt to do.
So that's a consequentialist, exterior oriented perspective. How can they use, or how do they use emotion, this emotion, other emotions to change the world into what they want it to be, change the galaxy?
I suppose. I mean, I'm not really thinking in terms of consequentialists or whatever. I'm trying to ask myself, why does it matter so much to Kevin that the Jedi feel sadness at this? And to me, the only reason why it would matter to feel that sadness is if it spurs action. Anakin is a good thing to bring up because you can point out how Anakin was failed and he was allowed to continue along his path for way longer than he should be because the Jedi got wrapped up in their war and he was one of the most successful generals. And people were blind to his flaws or thought that it didn't matter and that it let him be seduced by Darth Sidious. There's certainly like an argument to be made there. I just don't think that it impinges upon are Jedi good or not.
I want to bring up the idea of Jedi's as generals for a brief moment.
Sure.
So, episode three, Anakin is appointed to the Jedi Council by Palpatine. And as many memes have told us, this is not seen as something in the ordinary. It's a breach, it's an intrusion onto the Jedi. I'm going to say Palpatine had the right idea. You have a group of generals to help decide high grand strategy for a galactic war. Why shouldn't the government have not even a vote or a voice, but an observer status?
So I want to address two things because something that you haven't talked about, but I think is really important, is that the Jedi do not have military training in terms of leading soldiers. So it is a little
No.
bit bizarre that they are the generals when the Republic does have generals and does have a military. Now they cooperate, as we can see, like in the Clone Wars, but a lot of the Jedi's ability to act as generals comes from their martial prowess and their power over the Force. In terms of
They
the
should not be generals, captains,
yeah,
lieutenants,
no, I would
maybe.
agree. I think that, of course, then so generals allows them to kind of keep their autonomy more than being captains, but that's we could talk more about how that would work out. In terms of Palpatine having a representative, there are two ways to approach this. One is just Palpatine as Chancellor, and then there is Palpatine as Darth Sidious,
Yeah.
which they do kind of start to suspect as you get into the trilogy, as like Yoda's able to sense some darkness and stuff like that. Let's not forget that Anakin had been passed over for promotion a lot because there was darkness in him that people had sensed, and that he was allowed to sit as an observer. They didn't like it, but they let him do it. Now, if Palpatine was not a Sith Lord that has orchestrated the downfall of his own state, I would agree with you that having a quiet observer on the Jedi Council would be a good thing. It would also be a good communication vessel between government and kind of supernatural order that is helping to keep the peace. But Darth Sidious also like orchestrated the entire conflict with the intention of bringing
Yeah.
down the Jedi.
I get that. I do. I think in the abstract, alone, separate, it's a good thing. Difficult to extricate from the whole evil mastermind, but in a vacuum, it's a good thing. Now, I want to ask you a question. Are the Jedi better than normal people? They have, clearly magic powers. Like, they are different, set apart. Some would say better. How much should this impact our discussion?
I view this in two ways. They're certainly more capable than average
Yeah.
people because of the Force. And something that we will need to talk about is what do you do as a society when you have something like the Force? In my opinion, having a Jedi Order that is working in cooperation with the government is probably the best way that you can govern that. But you do also have the moral sensibility, you have the rationality that the Jedi Code strives to provide its members that ordinary people do not have to deal with. I mean, ordinary people do experience the fullness of emotions, which clouds rationality. And as somebody who I respect very highly rational people that think more about others than themselves, which is the mission of the Jedi Order.
Yeah.
So, in my opinion, the average Jedi, yes, is probably better than the average non Jedi. There are clearly bad apples, and there are clearly amazing people who are not Jedi. But on average, they will skew to be better.
So, should our expectations of how the Jedi as individuals and as institutions should comport themselves, should that be higher because of their higher capability? I think is a good neutral word to describe what they can do.
I mean, it would have to depend on the situation. I think specifically an individual action. Yeah, sure, you should expect the Jedi to make the quote unquote right decision more often than somebody else in the similar position, or the more disinterested or quote unquote objective decision, which of course does not mean that there won't be any mistakes and there's not blindness and faults and yada yada. In terms of expecting more from the Jedi Order, I think that's really difficult because there's not quite any organization like it to compare, at least in the structure of the Republican government. Of course, we can compare the Jedi to the Sith. And yes, we should expect better from the Jedi than from the Sith. But in terms of comparing them to a structure in the Republic, it's hard to expect better something from which there is no comparison. You should just expect them to do it well.
Let's briefly do compare them to the Sith because I want to say something that's kind of a hot take.
Are you going to say that the Sith are actually morally good and the Empire did
No,
nothing wrong?
it's
I
not
see
that hot a take.
I see your eyes. Sometimes I can't see your mouth, but I see the mischievous look in your eyes. I am afraid of what's about to come out.
To the average citizen, how much do we expect or assume that they would understand the Jedi and Sith are like substantively different and not just to give a comparison. Essentially, it's a religious conflict with two different sides of the same religion, if that makes sense.
So I don't think that we should expect them to even make a comparison at all because it seems, at least if I remember the prequel trilogy correctly, people had believed that the Sith had died out a long time ago.
Or
Jedi
well, not a
believed
couple
this.
thousand years before, when the Sith were around, with an order, with an empire.
Okay, well, that's a completely different question. So we're going to put that to a side because then that's getting into KOTOR territory that we can talk about. In terms of the prequels, most people do not have an idea that the Sith exist. So
Yeah.
they can't really conceive of this as are they two different sides of the same coin or whatever. We do know that there is a distinction to be made once we get into places like Jedi Fallen Order when the Sith take over because everybody, quote unquote, knows that the Jedi were bad or that the Jedi were killed, depending on how much you follow Imperial propaganda. But at that point, I believe they do know about the Sith. I don't know how much they know about the Sith. When it comes to KOTOR and the like, I think very clearly they cannot see them as just a religious conflict because it is a political conflict between the Republic and the Sith Empire that impacts people's everyday life like all the fucking time.
Oh yeah, what I'm saying is, would they distinguish the Jedi and Sith as like separate philosophies, separate belief systems, or would they be more?
No, I think that they would.
It's the same.
I mean, people do know about the distinction between the light side of the Force and the dark side of the Force, at least during times in which the Force is known. There's some really
Yeah.
weird writing with Star Wars in which the Force isn't well known, apparently, in the original trilogy, even though there's no way knowledge of that would have died out in the 20 years between the prequel and the original trilogy. But be that as it may, no, people know the difference between the light side and the dark side.
Okay, then. So I was thinking maybe the average citizen 4,000 years before the prequels might think of it as not Catholic versus Protestant, but say, I don't know, the Templars versus the Teutonic Knights or whatever.
Now, I kind of doubt that they would see it that way, at least those who had any inkling of knowledge. Now, there are going to be some people that just don't know anything and see lightsabers going around and everything. Though, even then, I think this sounds superficial, but the color of the lightsabers is going to make a big difference. One
Yeah.
side's all red, one side is very multicolored. There's a difference drawn there that people will be able to track.
So one question I have for you, the Jedi Order as it stands stood in the prequels, rigid moral code taking in from childhood. Did that need to be the case? Can we envision, say, coming into it in your late tweens, as a teenager, as an adult, maybe, a less monastic existence in some ways?
You know, I was
Would that have fixed the problems that we both agree exist? Would a different structure have fixed those?
So I think I've been thinking about this question a lot today because I knew that the whole child kidnapping thing was going to be a critique of the Jedi.
Not kidnapping. I don't think they kidnap, but the childhood induction, I think, limits them, blinds them.
Sure, I mean,
They don't have life experience.
certainly what they do is they take children from their families, perhaps with the consent of the parent, but still at a young age and all of that. And the primary historical parallel that I could draw is in the Ottoman Empire when the Janissaries took Christian children from their homes and then raised them as soldiers to protect the emperor and stuff like that. And I don't think that any of us would say that the Janissaries are a particularly moral institution. They can be useful for the maintaining of the Ottoman Empire, but it's not like that's good. When it comes to the Force, though, when it comes like let's look at the prime example of the one kid that we know that did get brought in as a teenager, who then destroyed the Jedi Order because he couldn't
Luke
deal with his
Skywalker?
emotions. See, no, that's a good point. So let's circle back to that in a second. But Anakin Skywalker clearly demonstrates that, at the very least, a kid who is very emotionally driven, he is emotionally driven as a kid, and it's
Yeah.
never really quite beaten out of him as he's training. And then, of course, there's all the honors and the whatnot that gets thrown on him and then he turns to the dark side. Now, Luke Skywalker is the perfect counterexample. Same kind of thing, has a desperate ambition for adventure. The difference with him is that he successfully learns the lessons of keeping your emotions in check and being guided by rationality. It's kind of a nice parallel since he is trained by the same guy as his father, right, with Obi-Wan. What that indicates to me, though, is that it is possible to become a good Jedi without having been taken in as a kid. However, it's also possible for it not to be the case and for it to lead to some very dangerous situations. And the practice of the Jedi for thousands of years is to limit that possibility by taking them and training them as children. And to me, that seems like the safest course of action.
Is it because of their different capabilities? Because in other parts of life in Star Wars and here and now, we don't mandate you learn this from childhood. What makes the different infant better? What component makes that almost a necessity?
There are certain things that we do mandate that people learn by a certain age and learn at a certain age. For instance, the ability to read. We try to get kids to learn it pretty early on. They're able to learn it relatively easily because their brains are young and are able to create connections very quickly. If you know any illiterate people that then have to learn how to read when they're 30, 40, it's very difficult for them because their brains have not been wired in that way. The fact, why are you looking at me like that for? It's a fact.
I was going to say, like, we don't demand, I don't know, construction workers get taken in by the guild at age two
No, but
professions.
what that proves, or with the principle that is asserted, is that children's brains are more malleable and flexible. This is not a case in which, okay, we want somebody to be a construction worker, so we're going to raise them up from the age of 3 in order to become the best construction worker. This is a case of this is somebody who has the possession of incredible power that most people cannot deal with. And if it's either we train them as soon as we can to control it, or it will control them and cause horrific consequences. So in that case, it seems to me that taking them in as kids is a good idea.
I see that. But I also wonder and think that allowing them to experience the human condition, to love and lose, to have heartache, to experience more of life would make them better interlocutors with the average person and would allow them to control their emotions better. If it's not, this is the first time I'm experiencing this really strongly at age 41. What do I do? If that makes sense.
I mean, I'm sure that teenage Jedi have crushes on the girls in their class and vice versa. I'm fairly certain that when I was a kid, I read a lot of young adult Jedi novels of Anakin being a Padawan, and I'm fairly certain that that came up a couple of times. So it's not like they don't deal with these. It's just that they teach the kids how to deal with their emotions in a different way.
No attachments. Does that mean like all, say, sexual activity is out? Can they have one night stands? I'm thinking like what kind of behavior is permitted? Is it more regulating behavior or mindsets?
I think it's both because behavior impacts mindset and vice versa. That being said, I'm fairly certain I've seen a couple of references to, Jedi having sex at a brothel, and that's considered, at least to the Jedi doing it, it is considered fine because it's not attachment. Now you do it too many times or it's noticed by the Jedi Council, they might look at you askance. But I don't think it's an unheard of practice. Kind of like think of the Night's Watch at Mole Town.
Yeah.
You shouldn't do it, but people also know that it happens.
We've talked about the Jedi as an institution. We've talked about the Jedi as individuals, specific case studies, the relationship to the broader government. What more? What other angles of inquiry have we left undiscussed?
But one thing that we have alluded to but haven't talked about is what do you do as a society when you have something like the Force that is only controlled by a limited number of people selected seemingly at random, but that can lead to very consequential actions when people use it. That's something that society has to manage. My thesis is that the Jedi Order, working in conjunction with the Republic, is the most constructive way to manage that, whereas the Sith Order or Gray Jedi or Dark Jedi are not particularly good examples of society dealing with that problem. But can you think of a better way? Can you think of a more useful version.
Yeah, I want to draw some comparisons to the Catholic Church as an institution. I
Okay.
think it's comparable, not in exact regard with the capabilities, but the separate from, but drawn from society. It's limited.
Okay.
So we can have, for example, the cathedral priest, educated at seminary, taken from the parents or whatever, with a very cloistered, almost literally education.
I mean, that depends on
What
your time
about,
period and everything. It's not like cathedral bishops now are taken in the cradle.
say, 1,000 years ago?
Okay.
What about something more modern, the so-called worker priest, the one who lives with their community, has a day job, interacts, ingratiates themselves with the daily lives of the parishioners? It's pretty common in Central and South America. That kind of thing seems maybe preferable where you have ties to the institution, but your first regard is to you can intervene with the lives of those entrusted to you best if you live among them.
I see where you're coming from. I don't really know much about worker priests because it's not the time period that I study, and my experience with Catholic priests is not that. They are the priests. They have their house in the church, and that's their job is to be the priest. I would say though that your solution, I think, doesn't work for the Jedi because of the limited amount of people. My impression of worker priests is that it is a way for the Catholic Church, it is a way for people to be able to afford to be priests in places where the church is not as rich, because a lot of churches it's not like the Catholic Church just distributes money to every single church. You are funded by your parishioners, and if your parishioners are poor, that means you're going to be poor, and sometimes that means you can't even afford a priest. So that's an economic thing. But also, anybody can be a priest. It is not regulated by natural ability. It is only regulated by piety and desire to do it, and ability to follow the strictures of the Catholic Church as it comes to the priesthood. So I don't think that that's a good comparison with the Jedi because of limited numbers, and because, at least in the current substantiation of the Jedi Order, they're being sent out to a bunch of different places all of the time. It is impossible then to create routes. Your idea would be to station a Jedi at one place, and then that place is Jedi. And I could see that working, and I think it does work. I think it does happen from time to time. But even then, we have to be dealing with either a citywide, countrywide, or planet-wide level. And a worker Jedi isn't going to be able to create the same ties with the people on that scale in the way that a worker priest would be able to do in a village.
Yeah, there's 10,000 Jedi and several tens of thousands of planets. So that I see. I just was thinking about what alternative structures that would be not quite so parallel to the functioning of the society that they choose to live a bit apart from.
Yeah, I can't really think much of at least stuff that I know about. I mean, I have a feeling there might be something there with Buddhist monasteries, but I don't know a whole lot about Buddhist monasticism. But something that
Just the emotional.
I mean, they are not as compared to medieval monastics. I don't believe that Buddhist monasteries are like as drawn away from society. But I could be wrong about that. But in terms of parallels or examples of alternative structures for the Jedi, one thing that it hit me. Did you ever read? This was before the sequel trilogy came out, but it was like Star Wars 100 years in the future, starring Luke's grandson
Yes,
or great grandson. So
Cade.
yeah, Cade Skywalker, the guy who I could never tell if death sticks were the equivalent of cigarettes or heroin, but either way, he loved them. But there, what we saw was that the Empire had been beaten back, not completely beaten, but a smaller state, and their ability to control the Force was the Imperial Remnant had a militarized Jedi Order, as compared to an autonomous Jedi Order. I don't know how well that impacted society, but what it certainly created was a bunch of Force users that were loyal to the state, as opposed to loyal to their own meats. I don't know if that's preferable. It sounds to me like that's more preferable for you. I do know that cadre of Force users are not as Puritan as Jedi are. That's one of the things that set them apart.
I think because they have such higher capabilities, I'm that much less trustful of extraordinary people following their own conscience when their capabilities can give them the power to defy the government. I guess I'm ironically more of an institutionalist in the political established institutions, and that these people who defy the state monopoly on violence, it feels like a dangerous game to have them follow their conscience as the higher order. When what if the conscience says launch a coup, disobey orders, attack the fleet? I want to inculcate civic responsibility.
I mean, I agree with inculcating civil responsibility. I think that my point, though, or at least my perspective, so if you have a highly integrated Jedi Order with the Republic, number one, the Jedi can be used more as pawns for the political games of whoever's in power rather than their own mission, which you can argue is good or bad, but I tend to think that is bad. And we do tend to see this at the end of the Clone Wars when they do become very tightly integrated. But also, what happens is that the institution itself becomes more politicized and less easy to govern because they are actually part of the state and therefore have more of an ability to enforce the laws and to take justice into their own hands. And there's less of a output to punish bad doers if they are influential enough with the government, which they are so tightly bound to. Whereas if you have an autonomous thing, okay, yes, the only people who are able to bring bad actors to justice are other Jedi, but that expectation is there. And because they have to cooperate with local governments as opposed to be the government, they do have to respect local laws and local institutions in terms of justice, in terms of arresting and handing them over and stuff like that. It actually inhibits the Jedi's ability to decide on their own laws.
And I get you. And it's so tough to make comparisons to draw what kind of thing can should be done from our items, because like a person devoid of institutions is just a person here. A person devoid of institutions in the Star Wars universe may be able to wreak catastrophic damage, to suborn the minds of anyone they meet, to do good and great things out in great magnitude because they're so much more capable. That's so tough to like how you design systems with this fact in existence.
I agree. And that is why my concluding argument is the same as my thesis. The Jedi Order, while it has flaws, is a good and useful institution that is hard to improve upon and are the good guys and are in no way quasi-fascist on the level of Stalin, Hitler, or Mao.
The Jedi Order, in my concluding statement, it's an imperfect construction, whatever they would have done. What they chose to incarnate, to insubstantiate, is not a good one. It has serious institutional and individual flaws. Their blindness led to the empire.
We can agree to disagree. Always a pleasure to talk to you about these things. Those listeners of ours who signed up for a Trails podcast and is wondering why we just spent the past hour talking about Star Wars, don't worry. Next week, we're back on Trails in the Sky SC. Chapter 7, I believe.
We're in the end game. It's chapter 7, then chapter 8, then the finale. We'll see. We might do 2 chapters in a row, 1 episode on 7, 1 on 8, 2 Sundays in a row. We might not. It depends on the holiday schedule. We'll keep you posted. I'm Kevin. That's Colin. See you next time.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.